Welcome back to the Daily Bible Breakdown, and today our passage is Genesis chapter 16 through 19. In chapter 16 we find that Abraham has yet another lapse of faith. Actually, in this case, it's both him and his wife Sarah. They're getting older and realizing that how can God's promise be fulfilled if we don't have any children? And so rather than trusting God and waiting on his timing, Sarah devises a plan. And Abraham fathers a child with her handmaid Hagar. The child's name is Ishmael, and he too would become the father of a great nation. But he was not to be the promised son through which the promises were going to be fulfilled. When we get to chapter 17, Abraham is now 99 years old. And at this point, his name is officially changed from Abram, which means exalted father, to Abraham, which means father of many. We also find that Sarah's name is changed from Sarai, which means basically like a princess, to Sarah, which means simply princess. A very subtle change, but both of their names are changed here to reflect what God plans to do with their lives moving forward. It's also in this chapter that we find circumcision is established as the official sign of this covenant that God had made with Abraham. And so he would be circumcised and all male children moving forward would be circumcised as well. In chapter 18, we find that the Lord actually visits with Abraham along with two angels, and Abraham is able to actually sit down and commune with them. And again, it's reaffirmed the promise that had been made about them having a child. But Sarah hears this from inside the tent and she laughs. They then call her out for laughing and she denies having laughed, but of course there was no denying it. It had actually happened. But there's a great question here asked, one of two in chapter 18, which I love, and that is anything too hard for the Lord? In response to her lack of faith, it was affirmed that God can do anything and does do anything that he pleases. It's later in this chapter that God reveals to Abraham what he's going to do to the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah because of their wickedness. He's going to completely destroy those cities. Abraham is, of course, concerned because Lot and his family live in that city. And so he begins to intercede on their behalf. You're familiar probably with the story. He asks God if he'd spare it for 50, then 45, then 40, 30, all the way down to just 10 people. And God does agree to those terms. He says, if there are 10 righteous people, I will spare the city. We learn a great lesson about prayer from the way Abraham persists there, and even from the motive that he had for praying and for the trust that he has, because that's when that second question gets asked, shall not the judge of all the earth do right? Ultimately, Abraham trusted that God would do the right thing. And unfortunately, there were not even 10 righteous people in those cities, and so God would proceed with his judgment. In chapter 19, we find that those two angels go into the city to warn Lot and his family about what's coming. Those two men are, of course, treated horribly while they are there. And Lot receives the warning and packs up his family and goes out. They're told not to look back. But unfortunately, his wife does look back. And as a result, she sees the destruction and is turned to a pillar of salt. Lot goes up away from the city with his daughters, and another unfortunate incident happens there as they get him drunk and they have an incestuous relationship with him. And we learn an important lesson about the consequences of our sin and our choices, because the two nations that would come from those children would be the Moabites and the Ammonites, who would be frequent enemies of Israel throughout their history. Well, that brings us to the end of our daily Bible breakdown for today. And we'll see you tomorrow when we jump into Genesis chapter 20.